Hey guys, welcome to today's workshop on just teaching chemistry in uncertain times. As we're facing this COVID pandemic and everything is changing, what do we do with that? And there's so many factors going on. There's the health and whether you should meet in person in school or whether you should meet virtually, or how is your school district going to be able to handle the technology load if you go virtual? How are your students going to be able to perform? A lot of those questions I'm not going to address because that's more of a school system or a school-wide decision. And so those are decisions that schools will make, like what's the proper way to deal with this? How do you do homework or even assessments? And a lot of that kind of stuff is going to be a little bit more school-based. What I want to focus on today is how do we teach chemistry? Now, how do we teach chemistry effectively as possible? In order to get our kids prepared. I think most of us should be trying to prepare our kids for either college chemistry or AP Chem, or at least that should be our baseline. You may have a lower class that's, they're just taking it just so they can get their science credit to graduate, and that kind of changes your priorities a little bit. For most of us, that's our goal. So what can we do to set them up for success, even in the craziness of what we're going through? And part of the wisdom I'm bringing to this is what happened to me back in 2010. I was about halfway through my teaching career. I was about year 7, year 8. And that school year, I ended one school year. I was at a small private Christian school. And I was pretty much the science department and part of the math department. And so I ended the year as kind of the head of the science and math departments. And then over the summer, I became what we call our academic dean, kind of the second in charge of the school, and doing scheduling and academics and coordinating with teachers and all that kind of stuff. By Christmas, I was the interim headmaster. And the whole time I'm teaching 4 classes that are 4 separate preps. It was crazy. Kind of like now is. Like I didn't know what was going to come at me that day. Like I could walk into the office and there'd be a discipline issue I had to deal with when I really needed to be prep and write a test for a class. So part of what I'm bringing here is part of what I learned from that experience of just being uncertain and being hit from all sides and not knowing what's going on and really feeling like my responsibilities far, far outweigh my resources. And that's what I want to talk to today. So as we talk about how to teach chemistry in this crazy time, I'm going to focus on 2 things. What are your expectations and what are your priorities? So those are going to be the 2 things we're going to hone in on primarily. And I'll tack on a few extra things as we go along. But that's the gist of it. And so, first of all, expectations. We could go through this year just thinking that it's going to be just like any other year. I don't know how well that would go for you. The picture that kind of pops in my mind is, if you have a captain of a ship, he's got a trip planned. He's going to travel from this port to this port. And as he's traveling, there's a storm coming. He has a chance to go around the storm, or he can stay his course and go right through the heart of the storm and maybe lose his ship, maybe lose some lives, maybe lose his cargo, or whatever. A responsible captain's going to adjust his plan to move his ship around the hazards so that he can, do what he needs to do, which is deliver his goods and his ship intact with all of his crew members safe and sound. That's kind of what we need to be doing this year. We need to kind of have a plan, but really our expectations need to be that this plan is going to have to change. There's going to be this storm that pops up in the middle of our route that we're planning on taking, or there's going to be this storm, or there's going to be this hazard, and we got to navigate around. And that's got to be part of our expectations. You see, the only thing that's going to be certain this year is change. And so if we have this expectation that, everything's got to go this way, primarily, you're going to get frustrated. You're going to get uptight. And when we as teachers get frustrated and uptight, our students get frustrated and uptight. I mean, seriously, like That's a big piece that we got to be looking at. And so we need to take care of ourselves first and just kind of what are our expectations? Because for example, some of you are going to start off virtual. Some of you may start off in the classroom. But I'd be willing to put down really good money that at some point in time of the year, those may switch. If you're starting in the classroom, you may end up having to go virtual. Come November, December, we get COVID plus the flu. Who knows? You may have to go fully virtual. Or if you're starting virtual, maybe we'll have this vaccine and we'll have it licked and you'll finish out the year in the classroom. So the high likelihood is that we're going to have both virtual and in the classroom. And when you're setting your expectations, what I think you need to be doing is let the virtual trump the in-classroom. Let the virtual decide what your classroom is going to look like, not the other way around. What are your policies going to be for your virtual classroom? How are you going to do homework? How are you going to assess things? Start thinking here. And then if you happen to be in the classroom, translate it over. Perhaps you can add a few extra things here in the classroom, but it's easier to translate that way. It's easier to start with the virtual and translate that into the classroom than it is to start in the classroom and translate that into virtual. And so in terms of setting your expectations of what your classroom is going to look like, what your class policies are going to be, how you're going to do things, start with the virtual, because that's really kind of the baseline. Then plan your in-class if you can. All right. Also, you got to have good expectations on yourself. Where are you in your teaching journey? How comfortable are you with teaching chemistry? That's going to come into big play here. Give yourself some grace. When's the last time you taught in a global pandemic where you had to teach virtually over online? Other than the little bit we had last spring, never. This is a new experience. So cut yourself some slack and be gracious with yourself. Instead of saying, oh, that failed, or that didn't work, the saying I've been using for myself lately is, wow, that did not give me the results I wanted. What can I do? Because for me, the word failure and bombed or whatever term you use, that carries a lot of emotional weight for me. It can get me all uptight. Once again, I want to be flexible. I want to be able to move around the storms that are in front of me. And so part of that is keeping myself flexible. And so if something doesn't work, that didn't work the way I wanted it to. What can I try next time? Gives me more flexibility and helps me out. Right, so expectations kind of for your class setting and how you're going to do class policies and all that kind of stuff. Expectations for yourself. Expectations for your students. This is going to be a learning curve for them, especially if you're at a larger school where you haven't taught these kids before. There's going to take them a long time. It's going to take them longer than normal to figure you out. It's going to take them longer than normal to figure out how your policies are going to work. It's going to take them a little bit longer than normal, especially if you're starting virtually, for them to get everything, how does the technology work? How do you turn in things? Be okay with that. First couple assignments need a grace period on how they turn it in and when they turn it in. Just trying to be that. So, but another big thing for setting expectations for students is this. Our students, in a sense, mirror what we put out. The golden rule, treat others how you want to be treated. So if you want your students to be flexible and go with the flow and not all uptight, you need to be that first. If you want your students to be, hey, today's a school day, and I expect you to come to school prepared and ready to learn, then you need to show up every day prepared and ready to teach. Because for me, you got kind of two ways you can go about this with your expectations for students. You can, and this kind of goes into our expectations for pacing as well. You can choose to teach at this level, a high level, the level you're used to teaching at. But guess what? You're not going to be able to teach as much this year. If you're having to go virtual for any major chunk of the year, you're not going to be able to go as quickly as you would normally like to go. That's just going to be the nature of things. And so you're going to have to kind of bring your pacing back. okay? And so if that's your expectations, then you got to bring your pacing back a little bit. Or you can bring down your standard and still cover everything. For me, my personal preference is the first one. I want to keep that high level of expectations. I want my students to learn. I want them to perform at this level. But if we're doing virtual, it's going to take me more time to give them the feedback, the instruction, the support, the resources to reach this level. And therefore, my pacing is going to be slowed. And that's my choice. But you got to have a clear expectation, which way do you want to go? If you try to play both of those, if you try to keep a high standard level and you're trying to get through the material, either you or your students or both of you are going to crack, because that's not sustainable, especially this year. I mean, like I said, it's just, I think everybody's going to be teaching virtually at some point in time in this year, even if your school is starting in class. I would wager that you're going to be virtual some point in the year, and you should have that expectation. And so think about how that's going to affect your pacing. Think about how that's going to affect your ability to do what you want to do. Which leads me to priorities. Because the same thing, if we go back to that illustration with the ship's captain, the captain has to decide what his priorities are. Are his priorities getting his product delivered on time? Or is his priority keeping his cargo safe, keeping his crew safe, keeping his ship safe? What are his priorities? Because that's going to affect what choices he makes. And if he's not clear what his priorities are, it's hard to make a decision, and you can kind of get lost like in the moment, thinking about what's best right then at that moment instead of thinking what's best long term. So for us teachers this year, we have to decide what our priorities are now so that we can make the best decisions long term, so that we can make the best decisions for what's going to be for our students when they get to the end of the year. Okay. So for example, if you're going to teach at a high level and your pacing is going to be affected, then you need to let that affect your choices now. Because you can't spend the normal amount of time you would on the first couple of units on like, hey, here's the introduction to chemistry, here's matter and energy, here's elements and compounds and homogeneous and heterogeneous mixtures, and here's some basic lab safety, and especially if you're starting in the classroom, and then here's atomic theory, and here's all these different things. And so as we get into teaching, we have to create our priorities. And so for me, one of the biggest priorities is going to be how I teach things. So let me show you kind of what I mean by that. Let me share this real quick. All right, so I've created this, and I'll give you the link to this when we get done. This is my prioritized list for teaching high school chemistry. Teaching during the current pandemic is, like I said, it's likely to force us to prioritize what we're going to be able to teach. Because if you're going to teach at a high academic level, you're going to have to pull back. You're going to have to, go slower most likely. And so early on, I'm going to choose what I choose to teach. So for example, that first chapter we usually teach, introduction to chemistry and all that kind of stuff. And it's not very important top content in terms of getting your kids prepared for college chemistry or AP chemistry. It's just not really that important. But it is important possibly for kind of what I have here. It's like, this is a good, easy chapter to kind of work on your classroom policies. How are you going to, especially if you're starting virtually, how are you going to do things virtually? How are you going to, do homework? How are you going to do classwork? How are you going to do, are you going to give them little quizzes during the middle of class that they have to do on their computers and turn in just kind of for you to be able to assess where they're at? What are you going to do? What's that going to look like? But then what I would do is kind of like, for example, here, history of the atom. So like if I know I'm not going to be able to get through everything I want, I'm going to breeze through history of the atom. I'm going to go faster through it than I normally would. I'm just going to probably give them a quick bullet list of, hey, here's Democritus, Dalton, Thompson, Millikan, Rutherford, Chadwick, Moseley, like just blow through it. But when I get to the structure of the atom, like being able to count protons, neutrons, and electrons and understanding how that works, then I want to be able to do that. And so, I want to be able to do that as I'm going, and so that'll make things easier. And so along those lines, when I get to a topic like wave physics, yes, it's in the standards. Yes, wave physics is part of, how we need to kind of introduce quantum theory. But for me, it's really low priority. I'm really tempted this year to skip it and just jump straight into, quantum history. And even then, I'm going to cover that quick. I do want to get them, I want them to understand S, P, D, and F orbitals and how to draw electron configurations and all that kind of stuff. But that's where I'm going to focus my time. And the reason being is this. We get to what I think are the most important things in chemistry: nomenclature, reactions, conversions, moles, and stoichiometry. To me, these are the core of chemistry. And the main reason I say this is because I tutored a lot, in my career, I've tutored a lot of college chemistry kids. And what I've seen is that their teachers cover nomenclature, reactions, conversions, moles, and stoichiometry in the first week, maybe two if they're lucky. And they expect the kids to know it. They expect the kids to remember it. And they expect them to move on. And then they move on as if everybody understands this. Like me as a tutor, the thing I dreaded the most was when that kid would come up to me that I'm tutoring. It's like, yeah, I didn't have chemistry in high school. This is the first time I've ever seen it. And I'm like, you're a creep. Because it's week 6 of the semester and you're just now getting to me, you're 4 weeks behind, if not 6 weeks behind. And so it's difficult. And so I'm going to adjust my pacing for the year so that I know that I focus on these things, so that I know that this is what I'm focusing on. And so that's what I want to do. And then, kind of after you get through stoichiometry, once again, pick and choose. But we've got to prioritize now at the beginning of the year what we want to have covered by the end of the year so that we can make good decisions all the way through. All right, and that's why prioritizing is so essential. The other thing you'll notice in here is I have this distinction: content-based versus skill-based. And here's what I mean by that. So for example, going up to the atom. The history of the atom, that's content. That's information that they just have to memorize and regurgitate to me. Okay, there's no skills that they have to practice. They don't have to, like when I do structure of the atom, part of that's content. I should have a check mark there too. But part of it's also skills. I want them to be able to look at a periodic table to tell me how many protons, neutrons, and electron an atom has, an isotope, an ion. I want them to be able to do that. But that's skill-based. When we're doing something skill-based like this, quantum mechanical model, drawing electron configurations, nomenclature, reactions, all of this stuff is skill-based. It requires practice, and it requires us watching their practice. It requires us seeing what they're doing, what mistakes they're making, why they're making those mistakes. So teaching these skill-based concepts is very different. And if at all possible, I'm going to want to really prioritize, when I'm teaching virtually, content-based. When I'm teaching in the classroom, because most of us will be in both at some point, like we've said that. When I'm teaching skill-based, I want that in the classroom. Content can be virtual because that's easy. So for example, if I was starting in the classroom, like I said, by November, December, you may be teaching virtually. I don't know. This is my normal scope and sequence. This is how I normally teach. I start here and I go. I would do lab safety first because I'm starting in the classroom. I would give them enough structures of the atom to be able to do nomenclature. I would skip quantum for right now. I'd give them enough periodic table to be able to do nomenclature, and I'd jump straight into this. Like literally probably by week 3, I'm into nomenclature if I'm starting in the classroom. Because it's so important to get that in the classroom. Because when I'm teaching a skill, I want to be able to see, I want to walk around and see what my kids are doing, and that's really hard to do virtually. I think it's doable, but hard. Kind of in contrast, if you're starting virtually, start here. Start with some of this basic stuff. This is relatively easy, structure of the atom. You can teach that online, I'm pretty sure. Quantum, yeah, that's a little iffy. That's a little bit harder, a little bit more out there for students. But if I'm still in teaching virtually by the time I hit covalent nomenclature, I'm probably going to put it off for a little bit. I may teach enough of balancing reactions to kind of allow me to teach what's on the rest of the year, but I'm probably going to skip all of the skill-based stuff if I'm starting off virtually. And then I would skip down here to this stuff. Because heat and reactions, you need to kind of understand reactions a little bit, but for heat, states of matter, gases and gas laws, solutions, equilibrium, you don't really need all that other content. You don't need those skills. You don't need to be, conversions a little bit for gases, being able to convert pressure units. But other than that, that's a lot of content stuff. So I would go there virtually, hoping, against all hope, that second semester I'll be in the classroom. And so depending upon where you're starting, you may want to approach what you're doing differently and be willing to reorder your year to make the most of what type of situation you're in. Same thing kind of goes for labs. Labs, you can't really, you can do demos, you can do YouTube videos online, virtually. You can get a lot of the same concepts. For like really dangerous labs, I never like doing them in my classroom. I would simply show the YouTube video version of it. And then we could still talk about it. I could still illustrate my point without having to deal with the super hazardous chemicals. Because most of those type of reactions are online because they're the really cool reactions. When you're in the classroom, pick and choose your labs. Don't do the ones you've always done just because you've always done them. Do they reinforce what you're teaching? If not, I don't think I'd use them. Okay? I think that's important. If they do, great. And use them. Or think about what skills you want your kids to have. If you want your kids learning how to use data and graph data, well, you can do that in the classroom, but you can also do that virtually. You can give them the data without them having to measure it. You can even show them how you're measuring. You can record a video where you put up the ruler next to it, or you use the scale, but they have to write it down on their lab sheet. Whatever, there are a lot of creative ways to get around that if that's a skill you want to emphasize. If you want them working on data, you can give them data virtually, and they can still work on it. And you can kind of be creative about how you're going to do that. The challenge, I think, for so many people is going to be specifically those of us who are stuck teaching virtually all year. If you're having to teach virtually when you get to nomenclature and reactions and conversions and moles and stoichiometry, it just got hard. I hope against all hope that doesn't happen. But if that happens, there are ways to kind of work with that. Once again, it's about priorities. For me, my number one priority when I'm teaching a skill is what I call student-driven pacing. And what I mean by that is I take my content and I break it into pieces. So for example, let me take ionic nomenclature just as an example. I break it into binary, just a metal and a non-metal. And then I add polyatomic ions, and then I add transition metals. That order can vary a little bit, but I kind of break it into 3 pieces. And so I want to make sure my kids fully understand binary ionic. Get it, are really comfortable with it before I add polyatomics. And then I want them to be really comfortable with polyatomics before I add transition metals. And then after we do that, then I add covalent back in that we've already done, and I give them a cumulative nomenclature test. But I'm going to make sure that they are prepared and ready for each of these before I move on to the next one. To me, that's called student-driven pacing. I'm letting my students' understanding decide how fast I go. Well, the key to making that work is being able to assess their understanding. That's why I want to do this in the classroom, preferably. Because when I'm in the classroom, how I would normally do this is I would teach for about half the period, and then I would give them classwork, and I'd be walking around helping my kids who don't get it, who are making mistakes, and assessing where they are as I'm walking around the room, helping them with their classwork and their homework if they get started with that. That's how I normally would do this. Can't really do that virtually. So virtually, short little quizzes that they have to take in class to kind of assess where they're at. That's one way of doing it. Hey, do you understand to this extent? Quick little poll questions or something like that that you can pre-write in to kind of assess where they're at and whether you need to go back and explain something again, or you can move on to the next topic. It could be them taking pictures of their work and posting it or sending it or wherever you want to do that, however your technology is being done. It could be, and if I could get my principal to sign off on this one, this is the one I would use, probably. I would break my class into smaller sections. Like I teach half the class one day and really work with them and help them, and they're literally having to take their video, however they're doing it on a phone or iPad or whatever, and they're having to put it over their homework so I can see it real time. And so I can assess it and give them comments. And then I would move to the next person and so on. I would do something like that. That's too time consuming to do in a whole class. Or you have like a help session with kids that are struggling and you do that kind of thing with them. There are lots of ways to kind of think around how to assess and how to help kids along the way. And I think that's critical, that we're able to kind of, once again, we got to have clear expectations of what we're expecting of them, but we also have to be flexible with our expectations. Because if we try to stay really rigid about how we're going to do something, especially this year, like I said, somebody's going to break, either us or the kids or both. But we also got to prioritize. And so for me, I'm prioritizing my students' learning. Are they mastering the content? And if that means I go really, really slow, I'm okay with that. That's mine. That's my priority. I'd rather my kids really, really know covalent nomenclature, ionic nomenclature, reactions, conversions, moles, and stoichiometry. I'd rather them really, if that's all we did for the whole year, which wouldn't happen, but if that was all we covered for the whole year, but my kids really got it and mastered it, I'd be okay with that. Because that's my priority. That's what I'm prioritizing. Assessments. Prioritize what you want to assess and how you want to assess it. Teaching virtually, your standard assessment types may or may not work. How we're going to do final exams if we're still in virtual, I don't know. That's just a headache waiting to happen. Think about that as you're doing assessments. How kids cheat online, that's a school decision. I'm not going to get into that. But when we do things virtually, the ability for students to cheat dramatically increases, without question. And so we've got to be mindful of that, but not let it cripple us. And so just think about how you want to assess, what you want to assess. Are you just simply wanting to know whether or not they get it? Then there are ways to assess that may not involve a grade. Are you really trying to get a grade in the grade book? Well, then think about that. And you're just going to have to kind of figure that out. And then the last thing that I would say that we have to prioritize is our structure and consistency in the classroom. Kind of like I said earlier, whatever your expectations are for teaching virtually, those need to be determining how you're teaching in the classroom, not the other way around. Because it's easier to go from virtual to classroom than it is to go the other way. And so same thing with just your structure and your consistency in how you teach. Structure it the same way. If you normally lecture bell to bell, then lecture bell to bell. Maybe tweak that a little bit, but just try to be consistent. And a lot of this goes with, you may be trying to find resources and things to help you out. You want things that are consistent, that the homework looks like the quizzes and the quizzes look like the test. That the kids aren't having to like reinterpret, like, what does that statement mean? That's worded differently than I've seen when they get to the test. That's not really fair to the kids. You want them to know this, then explain it to them the way you want them to know it. So you're looking for something that's consistent and thorough all the way through. And I think that'll win kids, once again, to being better there. Okay. So setting good expectations and having flexible expectations. That was our first thing we covered. Second thing, and really kind of the main thing we focused on so far, is priorities. The third thing, and this is the tricky one, is if you're starting off virtually, is trust and relationships. Chemistry is tough. It's a tough class to teach. It's a tough class for most kids to learn. And so normally when I teach, there's a lot of what I do in the classroom that I'm building the trust and the relationship between me and my students. For example, I oftentimes am willing to spend the first 5-10 minutes shooting the breeze with my students. Some people find that like, you need to get going teaching. Well, I am teaching. I'm teaching my kids that I'm interested in their lives, that I care about them, that I'm with them and for them. Because here's the thing I've learned is that when I communicate to my kids, when I build that relationship with them, when things start getting tough and I push them to this level of expectation, they go there because they know I'm with them and for them. That makes a huge difference. I mean, think about it. Like, think about what bosses you've had who, like my most recent, dean over the level that I was teaching in, he was a former teacher. So when he asked me to do something extra, I knew he wouldn't give it to me unless he really thought it was important. And so I would step up and do it because I had that trust and relationship with him. I've had other bosses who were never teachers and would give us busy work to do as teachers, and I begrudgingly did it every single time and hated it. And so our students are the same way. When our students understand that we are with them and for them and we're not giving them busy work, that we don't just assign things willy-nilly, and that we're going to help them learn if they don't understand, that is dramatic for increasing their performance in my classroom and in your classroom. And so you've got to somehow make that happen. Some of it could be sharing your kind of stories, or maybe you have, like if you finish a test and you finish a unit, and before you start the next unit, it may be the kids just need to vent and have a gripe day. Listen to them, respond to them. That may be what they need that day. Once again, you're building that relationship. That can be sometimes hard to explain to an administrator that that's what you're doing, but that is also part of teaching. It really is. Teaching is not just about the content. It's about the relationship. It's about the trust, because that's going to reap you major benefits down the road. And kind of the same thing with student-driven pacing. I forgot to say this when I was there, but student-driven pacing is on the front end slower. Because I'm not moving on until my kids get it. But on the back end, it's faster. It seems counterintuitive. But like, for example, I spend a lot of time on conversions. And I make sure my kids can do conversions in their sleep. So that by the time I get to the mole unit, all I'm doing is giving them 3 new conversion factors. Boom, 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 boom. I can cover the mole unit in under 2 weeks. Easy. And that's with doing percent composition and empirical molecular formulas. Because I laid the foundation, which allowed me to do that. And then if I make sure they really understand mole conversion, when we add stoichiometry, all I'm doing is adding an extra step. Easy. Because I laid the foundation. And that's so much of what we've got to really focus on this year especially, is that we're laying the foundation strong and firm and secure so that everything we build on it stands. If we rush through something, that foundation is going to be wobbly and everything may collapse. And so this year especially, we've got to hone in and do that really well. And then my last main point is you've got to take care of yourself. Part of that's health-wise in terms of your mask and washing your hands and all that kind of stuff. But a big part of it's going to be mental, emotional. Take care of yourself. It is easy to do what I call unplugging. Netflix binge, alcohol, eating whatever fruit, just popping down in front of the TV to watch TV. All those things that are kind of like vegging out, they're unplugging. But think about a battery on your phone. A lot of times in devices, if you turn them off all the way and you let them sit there for a couple hours and you turn them back on, you'll have a little bit more battery power. Unplugging does give you a little more battery power, just a little bit, but not as much as recharging, of actually plugging it in. And so we work the same way. Instead of a Netflix binge, choose a walk. Instead of alcohol, choose talking to a friend. Instead of sweet and fatty foods, which are my thing that I struggle with, go to the gym, get the endorphins that way. So even if we're starting out this year, we need to be thinking this too. Because once again, if we don't make these a priority now, they're going to get lost along the way, and that's going to be really key for us as we go through this year, that if we're not prioritizing that from the beginning, it's not going to stick as we go along. And so it's important that we do that. And so kind of bringing it all back down is, in order for us to succeed this year, we need to start thinking about our expectations now, our expectations for our class, ourself, our students, our pacing. That it's going to be difficult this year, and we're going to need to be flexible with our expectations. Things aren't going to work the first time, and we're going to have to redo things and figure that out. That's fine. We need to be okay with that this year. And then priorities. We got to set our priorities now so that we can stay on course through the whole year. Our priority on what topics we really want to focus, make sure we get to. Because once again, pacing is going to be off this year. So you got to pick and choose, where are you going to focus? How are you going to focus content versus skills? Once again, content's really easy to teach virtually, skills not so much. So I would really, if you're starting in the class, start with skills. If you're starting in virtually, start with content, and then hopefully flip when you end up having to flip. Pacing, and just be willing to reorder things, assessments, labs, your structure, all of that. And kind of as I said at the very beginning, a lot of this advice for me came out of this year of craziness for me, where I went from, in a 6-month span, I went from science department chair, academic dean, to interim headmaster of a small school that was barely staying afloat, while teaching 4 different preps in 4 class periods. And it was chaotic for me, and I had to have expectations like this. I had to have priorities like this to make it through, but also I had to somehow streamline my prep. Because I was putting in crazy hours just trying to keep the school afloat and just trying to be prepared for the next day. I had to come up with ideas to make that work better. And what I did there is I created a system of handouts and worksheets and stuff that I could use later on to do that very thing. And so let me show you that real quick. Let me show you what I created there. And so this is at Teaching High School Chem /member/covalent. And this is a free page that you can see. Of course, it wants to be slow loading right now. But this is what I created. I created what I call the Academy at Teaching High School Chem. And it's a paid thing I do, but it is really meant to give you everything you need resource-wise. Because like I said, in this pandemic, there are going to be times where we feel like our responsibilities far exceed our resources. And so I want to give you resources. And so kind of this is, if normal school year, a pacing guide idea. Teaching videos where I teach you how to teach it. Then teaching notes, PowerPoint slides that you can use to teach it so you don't have to create your own PowerPoint slides. Then handouts for kids, quizzes for kids, once again, broken into topics. And then test, and a review. And so I created all of this. And this page right here, Teaching High School Chem /member/covalent, that's yours. This is a free sample that I give out. You can use anything on this page that you want. And, so let me give you the links to that and a couple of other things real quick. This is that list that I showed you where I went through and have everything prioritized. It's at teachinghighschoolchem.com/prioritize list. Just type in that in. You don't have to give me email or anything. You just get that list. And so that gives you everything you need to kind of, like I said, at least it's a starting point. You may disagree with me on what is high priority, medium, and low. That's fine. Feel free to disagree with me. But that's what I have there, and that's critically important. And then on the sample page, that's what I just showed you. So you can see what the Academy looks like. And if that is resources that would look helpful to you, that resources like that could really help streamline your year and make your year easier. I mean, especially if you're if you're starting off virtually and you're going to have to do virtual school with your own kids, then this is an amazing resource for you. And there's the actual primary page that I used, where you can find all the information about the Academy, what I cover, what it offers. And one of the things I do offer is I offer a one-on-one hour with me per semester. That could be 2 30-minute calls in a semester. That could be just one hour. But like where you've got questions and you need answers, and it's a little more complicated than just something we can do over email, then we can do it on Zoom. We can hop on a call and we can work through it together. For my Academy members, I'm reachable by email, Facebook Messenger. I've had lots of conversations about a lot of chemistry topics over email and Messenger, and been able to do that. I want to help you. That's why I do this workshop. I'm passionate about students learning chemistry. And because I'm passionate about that, I'm passionate about helping teachers do it well. And so that's why I want to offer that resource to you there. And so, like I said, going through this year requires really needing to be flexible and prioritize, because we do have limited resources. We really do. And we have a lot of responsibilities coming at us. So if we set our expectations and hold them loosely, and we set our priorities here to begin the year, and we take care of ourselves, then I think we can meet those responsibilities. And that's what I'm here to help you with, through this workshop, and then through email. If you have other questions, you can email me as well, Jeff at Teaching High School Chem. And look forward to serving you however we can.